When I went to Bosnia Herzegovina in 2017, a lot of the cities are surrounded by these mountainous areas. And so as we were visiting the city of Mostar, there's a cross that's up on a hill. And it wasn't necessarily about going to see a cross, but it was about walking up on this, I should say it's more than a hill, but it was about kind of just observing the city below us. So I took this picture even on a bad phone in 2017. And you can see some of the snow in the mountains and just the beauty of this city. And so as you're walking up this grand way up into the top of this mountain area that had this little like pebbled paved trail, it was the reminder of a war that took place there in the early 90s amongst three people groups. And you can see some of just the fortified shelters that were still there today. But it was more than that. As we were walking on the trail, the individual we were with said, "You have to stay on the trail. Often the weeds and the brush could still be mines that you could step on." I just wasn't willing to risk it at that point. And but it was the reminder of how there was just mines all around us. And so according to one site, even in Bosnia today, there are still 79,000 active mines. And since 1996, 1,766 people have died after the war from stepping on one of these mines. Pretty incredible, pretty sobering in this idea. And so Paul's going to show us today that there is another battle that's always being active. It's different than this one. It's actually a battle that takes place inside of our own lives, actually in our mind. And it's a battlefield that we have that as we walk through life, we're going to see especially there's 4 mines we can step on in life or come across in life. And Paul is going to give counseling to this church in Philippi, and we're going to be able to see some very tangible and active ways that we can walk through this battlefield as well. These things that this church was dealing with, I believe, are 4 things that we all deal with as well in our own lives. And as we talk about this idea of God speaking, there may be just one of these that you're like, I got to do something with this. I got to change the way I am with this, or I have to deal with this, or let Christ into this part of my life as well. And so if you have a Bible, you can turn me to Philippians chapter 4. We're going to begin in verse 1. If you don't have a Bible with you, it'll be all up on the screen behind me as well. And he begins Philippians chapter 4. He says, therefore. So the therefore is you got to go listen to Brian's sermon from last week and everything Brian said. Therefore, my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy, he says, and my crown, stand firm, right? Standing firm is a military word. Stand firm in this battle. Stand firm in the Lord, my beloved. Again, just a quick recap. We've been looking at this idea of joy, and we want to keep coming back to how do we find joy in our life? And the word joy there really just gives us the starting point for that in the J.O. and the Y. We find joy first when Jesus is the top thing in our life. When you have a relationship with Christ, your joy comes from Jesus, ultimately, primarily, and then secondly, it's about putting other people above yourself. And we've been looking at throughout. So it might not have used the word joy at certain parts, but we saw the idea of placing Christ at the highest point, or as Paul would say, I want to know Christ above all else. And then there's other parts where he says, consider other people better than yourself. And in the midst of that is where we find joy. And as we turn to verse 2, he now will get into where this battlefield really begins. And he begins with talking to a couple people within the church, and he says, I entreat Euodia and Syntyche to agree in the Lord. Yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of the fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. So he has these 2 women who are in a disagreement. They're in an argument. They're in conflict resolution. They're in conflict in the church. And so he talks about that. Then he goes here to verse 4 and he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say it, rejoice. Let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. And so he's going to give us, he basically takes this idea of this counsel to them as he finishes out this letter of really 4 minds we have in our life that we have to battle as followers of Christ. And it looks like this: conflict resolution between relationships. It's the lack of joy we may have in our life. It's showing grace to other people, even when they don't deserve it, even when they rub us the wrong way. And it's anxiety. He says, here's the 4 minds we can step on in our lives. And we're going to look at these and break down each one to see. And again, this is where it maybe would be that piece where you're saying, this is what God is saying to me in regards to these pieces as well. So the first one we just read here, we have these 2 women who are in a disagreement in some way. He doesn't give insight to that. He probably doesn't need to, because they know what's going on. But he's asking them to agree in the Lord. To agree in the Lord. Let's think about this more for our own lives. Think about that. If you're in conflict with someone, what's your response to that? What's your response to conflict? Let me just give us a couple different ways that we often respond to conflict. Number one, we think the worst of the situation or the other person. That's what we typically do. We think of something, our mind goes wild. This is why I'm saying it's a battlefield of the mind. Our mind begins to race. Our mind begins to create scenarios. The second thing we either do is we fight or we flight. We flee. We either just leave, right? We often see that. People just get up and go. And often in the church, the latter one is the one I often may see the most, where you say, hey, no, we can deal with this. We can work through this. And I'm good. I'm just done. Is that what God intends for our lives? Lastly, we just want to be right. Right? We want to win. We want the other person to be wrong. And this is often our response to those things. The other thing I want you to think about too is we often, again, this is why it's called the battlefield of the mind. I want you to wrestle with this when it comes to conflict resolution or being in conflict with individuals, is what story are you telling yourself? Think about that for a moment. When you're in conflict with someone, what story are you telling yourself? And again, oftentimes I find the stories that we can tell ourselves aren't even true to begin with. They're just things that we've created in our mind or scenarios that we've created that we need to deal with. So what's Paul's encouragement to them to not be stepping on these landmines of being right and fighting or flighting or looking at it the way I want to look at it or thinking the worst of someone else? He tells them to agree in the Lord, which means be of the same mind together. Be of the same mind. Agree in the Lord. What I believe Paul is getting at here is what we looked at several weeks ago in Philippians chapter 2, where Paul tells the church, he says, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking out to your own interests, but each of you to the interest of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. So he says here, be of the same mind. He already told them earlier, here's the mind you're supposed to have. And how do you have that mind? It's by having that mind of doing nothing out of selfish ambition, but in humility, considering others better than yourself. And so what Paul is getting at here in terms of conflict resolution is humility of the mind. Humility. This is what he's saying. This is what's going to get you through conflict resolution, is when you can walk in with humility to walk through this. You might say, I don't know the outcome, but I'm willing to take a step forward. I'm not sure how they're going to respond, but I'm going to do the part God's called me to do. Agree in having the same mind doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree to disagree, or it means it means I have to let them get that way out. What he's saying here is, no, the way you process through this is having the mindset of Christ. That's the way you work through this. And he goes on here, and you can read that throughout the week to say, he tells them this is what the mindset of Christ looks like, and he shares with them Christ, who was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. Rather, he emptied himself into the form of a servant, being born here as a baby, as a man, fully God, fully man. So he says, he's not saying, here's your outcome. He's saying, this is the way you journey through your conflict resolution. Because let's be honest, that's some of the biggest landmines we have. Right? Your mind might, or I said the fall, and you probably are already thinking, man, I got a landmine coming to Thanksgiving dinner. Right? How do I deal with that? Well, he says, have the mind of Christ. Now, if it's two believers that he's talking to, he's saying both of you should have the mind of Christ. This is what it means to agree in your mind, or agree in the Lord of these things. So, think about, is there anybody you need to agree in the Lord with? There's someone you're like, I just need to have this humility. I need to have the humility of the mind. I need to change the way I'm thinking about this situation. God's not calling me to walk away. He's not calling me to fight this person deeper. He's calling me to change my mindset so it doesn't just explode or become worse. But it's to have the humility of Christ, the same mindset as Jesus in these things. Ultimately, we see Jesus gives us the greatest form of conflict resolution in resoluting our sin problem on the cross, taking our place. That's the first landmine we can have in life. Conflicts with other individuals in our relationships. The second one is the lack of joy we may have in life. He says this, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say it, rejoice. He gives a command here, and he says, rejoice in the Lord always, and he says, do it again. Because again, typically we don't always get it right the first time, so he's like, nope, do it again. We often, this is what we've been talking about in this series, that we often find our joy in the circumstances of life, whether good or bad. Oftentimes that can be most likely referred to as happiness because it's fleeting, but he says here, rejoice in the what? The Lord. It's looking at what Christ has done for you and rejoicing in that. It's looking at your inheritance that's already in heaven and rejoicing in that. It's looking at the things Christ has done for you that no one can take away and rejoicing in that. And then he says, when you get done with that, just do it again. And as we talked about the formula of that, of Jesus, others, and yourself, let's think about this for a moment. What can steal our joy? Throw some things out there for me. Ego? Okay. What else? Pride, anxiety. Life. He's like, just going through the week, right? Who said the Yankees? Anybody? I thought I just heard that. Right? So, jealousy, okay? Yeah, there's a lot of things that can steal our joy, or we go through life and we maybe consider them joy zappers of life. But what Paul is telling us here about this idea of rejoicing in the Lord is that rejoicing in the Lord is not a reactive thing. It's a lifestyle. It's how we live our lives as believers. One theologian says this, the joy of the Lord is not a thermometer, the joy of the Lord is a thermostat, not a thermometer. A thermometer registers conditions, a thermostat controls them. This should be the baseline of our life. He says, joy should be the thing that sets the tone for the rest of your life. It's not running into a bad day to say, you know what, I need to focus on being a joyful person. It's not, well, life didn't go the way I want, so I need to reconfigure some things. He's saying, no, this is the baseline of your life. This is the tone you set for the rest of your life, is rejoicing in the Lord always. We could discuss some different ways that we can do that. It's something that's internal to us, but we'll talk about more of that in a minute. As I think about the idea of tone, my mind again comes to what's coming up this fall, and that is the football season. And we talk about, as I coach football, we talk about we want to be the one on the field on Friday night to set the tone. We don't want other teams to set the tone for us. We don't want other teams to control us. We want to set the tone, right? As a pass rusher on the field for the Giants, they want to set the tone. for the game. Joy is what sets the tone for our life. It's not a reactive thing. It's a way of life. It's a lifestyle. It's not waiting till something goes awry. It's doing it always. That's why he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Do it again. Because it's a lifestyle. Oftentimes what we do is we wait till something in life doesn't go well, and then we try to figure this joy thing out. So he says, combat the lack of joy you may have by making it a lifestyle in your life. So again, how do we do it? Well, you put Jesus at the top priority of your life. We talk about what does he want for your life? How am I supposed to live life? Put other people above yourself. That's a tone to set for your life. Is that the tone for your life? Or is it about you first? And then yourself last. So how do you combat a life of a lack of joy? Well, he says, rejoice in the Lord always. Not in the possessions you have, not in the circumstances of life. Because there's a battle inside of your mind that always wants to steal your joy, and it's a minefield all around us. The third thing now is in the battlefield of the mind is showing grace to other people. He says this in verse 5, let your reasonableness be known to everyone. The Lord is at hand. One of the better ways that this word translates is to show grace. It's an internal attitude toward other people. Showing grace is a free gift to other people. Now, we often might think of grace as, well, someone does something to me and I just let it go and I'm being nice about it, or I'm allowing someone to continue in their sin. That's not necessarily what that means. There is opportunity to show grace in someone's sin by still showing truth, because Jesus was full of grace and truth. But there is just ways in our life to be able to be a person of grace. Let me give one story, and maybe this will speak to you in some different ways. This is a story of Charles Spurgeon up here on the right and a man named Joseph Parker. Charles Spurgeon in the 19th century in London was a pastor, and he had an orphanage. And he would bring kids into his orphanage. And one day, Parker in one of his sermons mentioned the status of these kids coming in, and just making a simple claim of how destitute these children were, and not meaning anything against that. But in those days, did you know that the newspapers would actually show up to the sermons, and they would take clippings, and they would interview them, and they would post them in the newspaper. And Spurgeon reads this and takes it in a very bad way. And so the following Sunday, Spurgeon gets in and he starts preaching, and he blasts Joseph Parker from up front. How dare he say things about our orphanage? He took it very personable, right? That's what we often do. Someone might say a very general statement. It's a very personable thing. I saw a quote this morning for someone that said, a mark of a mature Christian is how easily offended are you. But here, Spurgeon was offended. Not saying he wasn't a mature believer. And so what does Parker do? Parker the next Sunday gets up, and more newspaper reporters show up. What's he going to say? People on the edge of their seat, right? That doesn't happen anymore nowadays. Parker gets up there and he says, you know what we're going to do today? We're going to take an offering for the orphanage. And it said that the offering plates went through 3 times because they had to keep emptying them. And Parker and Spurgeon went and they reconciled. And Spurgeon says that you have, Joseph Parker, practiced grace on my life. That's what he says. Pretty powerful story there. And what Paul says to this church is, he says, let your reasonableness, or let your graciousness, he says, be known to everyone. That's what it says. And so what we have to wrestle with is your graciousness evident to all people? Because we can be gracious maybe inside the walls of the church, but then when we get on social media, we're blasting people. Or we live in this type of society where, like, we might not know the individual personally, and we love to blast them, right? We live in that culture of we're willing to say anything sometimes just to be right or to put the other person down, right? You can go look at politics all day long. Is there grace in your politics? Is there grace in how you treat your neighbor who's different than you? Is there grace in how you treat your coworkers? Because this is a landmine, because in your mind, you're saying this isn't right, or they can't be this way, or they need to be this way. and we try to force them into some way rather than showing grace in their lives. This is a landmine we have. Is your graciousness evident to all people in your lives? Or are you harboring something going on? He says here, secondly, the Lord is at hand, or it simply means the Lord is near. And Paul could be saying two things here, which both I believe can be right. First one is the Lord is near, or the Lord is at hand. It means now, that God sees your life. It says we're going to be held accountable one day for our lives, but also he can give us the power in the now to be a person of grace. It's not something you're called to always muster up. You might need to simply say, Lord, I need help showing grace in this situation. Help me to be a person of grace, undeserving favor to this individual. Or it might mean that the Lord is near. It means eternally, when Christ comes back, how will he find you? Is he going to find you harsh or a person full of grace? Think about that. Is he going to find you harsh or a person full of grace? The last minefield that we can walk through in life is anxiety. Now, oftentimes, I've preached several messages on the idea of not being anxious. Again, when the Bible's written, Paul wasn't like, all right, Philippians 4:5, here it is, church. He wrote a letter. Man later on put verses to help people find where this was in the canon of Scripture. But think about it this way. He says, the Lord is near. The Lord is near. So do not be anxious about anything. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. This is a word I hear very often. I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with being anxious. What does this word mean? This is where we can see where this begins to tie in even more. That the word anxious means angst. It's a sense of unease that happens in your mind. This is when you break down this word, it's a sense of unease that happens in your mind. Now, we can start to see where these things lay out. If you have conflict with other people, sure, it may be a source of anxiety. Or you've had past conflict with people, and maybe you have trauma that you carry from past conflicts, and that is your source of anxiety as well. Maybe it's you allow everything to steal your joy, and therefore you're anxious as well. We have all different reasons for why we can be anxious. We'll talk about maybe more in a minute. But would you consider yourself anxious? Are you an anxious person? Do you deal with anxiety? It's not to shame ourselves. It's not to think less of ourselves, because Paul says it's a real thing. It's a minefield that we walk in. However, though, we do need to come to grips with, when we look at statistics, we live in the most anxious nation in the world. There is something about our culture that we live in America, that our society is the most anxious in the world. That could be from many different ways. We spend the most money in pharmaceuticals on anxiety. Now, again, we can talk about, if you want to see some past sermons about how Jesus can heal these things, happy to pass these along. We do carry soul wounds as people, and Jesus wants to heal these things in our life. But some other reasons why we're the most anxious is, a couple different ones, is we live a life of hurry in our life. We're busy people. Secondly, how fast-paced life is. For instance, 200 years ago, if you wanted to go to New Hartford, you got on your horse and buggy, maybe got there, maybe made a couple-day trip out of it, and now I can be there in 20 minutes. If I wanted to go to the West Coast, I had to do this thing called the Oregon Trail. I could probably literally book a flight after service, get on one tonight, and be in California tonight. Our life it's so quick, it's so fast-paced, and they say that can often act as a source of anxiety for us, and we don't realize it. Secondly, in terms of technology, we've had more change in the last 30 years in terms of technology than the previous 300 years with technology. You can pull up your phone and literally watch a war happening in your hands when maybe 100 years ago it would take 6 to 8 months to even get there that the one was happening. And now I can watch it live in my hand. So what does that do to our souls? What does that do to our state of anxiety? And let's just say you think something's going on in your life and you Google search it. Now all of a sudden on your Facebook and your Instagram, the algorithm picked up on that, and now you're reading article after article, it keeps posting up, and now you're thinking, man, there's something is wrong and this is going on, and it feeds our anxieties that we have in life. Is that really the way we've been called to live? Paul says, though, rather, do not be anxious about anything. He says, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. I just want to take this direction. There's been studies that have been done, and I'll just read a quote from a study that says this: the brain cannot respond to anxiety and gratitude at the same time. It's an either-or situation. We can feel anxious and other negative feelings, or we can feel grateful and all the positive emotions that are associated with that. So let's think for a moment, as people, what if we are anxious because we lack gratitude? I'm just throwing that out there. I'm not saying like, I'm throwing this out there as this the idea. He says, do not be anxious about anything. Rather, with prayer, thanksgiving. And isn't that an amazing study that anxiety and thanksgiving cannot exist in the brain at the same time? So the ultimate question is, one of the greatest things to do to fight anxiety is to be a person of gratitude. So do you need to grow in your gratitude? Now, what does that mean? What do you think that can mean to grow in your gratitude? Just thinking like, just walking through the day and just being like, oh, thank you, or thank you. Like, what does that actually look like? I was reading something the other day, and someone wrote out the challenge, because I wouldn't think of this. And they basically said, at the end of every day, write 3 to 5 sentences of thanksgiving. And you might say, well, after 2 days, nothing changes. It's not about that. It's a process in our lives. One of the greatest ways, Paul says, to fight your anxiety is to be a person of thanksgiving. And that's where you might say, I have nothing to be thankful for. And that's probably the problem we have. Because there's always things to find, even in the hardest of circumstances, to be thankful for. So the way we fight that is through thanksgiving in our life as a remedy to these things. So the battlefield of the minefield that we can walk through are these 4 things. Rather, Paul would say, here's how you fight them instead. Let's flip them and say, here's how we're called to stand firm. Humility to agree or have the same mind of Christ with someone. The other way he says is to rejoice in the Lord always, to show grace at all times, make it evident to other people, and lastly, be a person who gives thanks, not as reactive things, but as a lifestyle in our lives. It's not waiting till something bad happens so your anxiety can rise. It's saying, these become a lifestyle in my life. These become a lifestyle to have the humility and the mindset of Christ in my relationships. It's the mindset of I'm going to rejoice in the things God has done for me no matter what. Life is good or bad, this way or that way, it doesn't matter. It's to have a lifestyle of showing grace to all people and being evident to others. And lastly, giving thanks for what has been done. He says it's in these things, when you stand firm, he says that the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard, another battle word, it will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So what he's saying here is when you live this way in the lifestyle of these things, it will begin to guard your hearts and your minds. I know oftentimes we just want to say a prayer and let God do all this work in our life. And there's truth. God can do amazing things. He can do amazing miracles that we read this morning. but there's a role we play as well. There's a will we have. There's a free will we have in our walk with Christ as well that we play. And so again, it's these, the conflict resolution, the lack of joy, the showing grace, and anxiety. And so I believe that's why Paul says, as we close this out this morning, in Philippians 4, 8, and 9, he says, all right, let's look at it one more way. He says, finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's anything that's excellence or anything worthy of praise, think about these things. What you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So he goes back to it. Now he says, what you think about matters. The battle is taking place and taking ownership of that in your life. So this week, which one of these do you need to say, I need to wrestle with this? We ask that God would speak into one of these areas in our life. Which one of these you're like, I gotta deal with this week? And your response should be one of these in place. So what is it going to be in your life this week? These are 4 things we all deal with, and these are all pieces in our life that we wrestle with. Paul gives them a counseling session in their minds to deal with these issues of life. We're going to close with a special song, and I just want you to sit here to consider which one of these is God dealing with in my own life. As we talk about this idea of joy, all of this right here, these 4 things begin with a relationship with Christ. Outside of Jesus Christ, it's impossible to work through these things. So it has to begin with the person of Jesus Christ. If you do not have a relationship with the person of Jesus Christ, that's where it begins. The love he has for you, the new life he has to bring, taking your place on the cross, rising again from the dead. Jesus, the ultimate source of joy, has to begin there. Because you can try really hard at those things, but it ultimately comes from that relationship with Christ in those things of how we live it out. And lastly, whatever you believe God is dealing with in your heart right now, just lay it before him as we close in a special song and just consider these things this morning.